Have you seen the movie Taken? About a young woman vacationing in Paris, kidnapped and sold by her mysterious captors? My story is much closer to home. I met my trafficker in my private Christian high school. He was the grade above mine. He lured me out of school with promises of a good life, assuring me that I could just get my GED and become a success. Then he started advertising me online without my knowledge. That's when men started coming to our apartment to rape me. Even then, I didn't understand what was happening. I knew I had been raped, but why were these men handing my husband money? What did that mean? I grew up with the same media as everybody else. Prostitution is the movie Pretty Woman. Trafficking is that term you never really hear from that documentary you once saw about a kid chained to a radiator in another country. Neither were what my situation looked like. So what was this? But that's not unusual. Here in America, less than 10% of trafficked women are kidnapped. Most are enticed into it by men who gain their trust, posing as a boyfriend and offering them false promises. The average age of a teen enters the sex trade in the US is 12 to 14. Typically, this is prefaced by years of sexual abuse, the root of trafficking in many cases. And human trafficking is the world's fastest growing crime. There are more people in slavery today than any other time in history. This is why it makes empowering the front lines that more vital than ever. There were people during my exploitation who might have seen the signs that I was trafficked. One time I went to a medical clinic to be sewed up from a cut given to me by my trafficker, but I was never asked about my situation. There was the owner of the clothing boutique that I worked at. She would ask me if I was okay, but my trafficker would park his car in front of the shop, shine his brights in to watch me to ensure that I wasn't telling anybody. Of course, you could also say I didn't realize my situation. Statistics tell us that it takes 14 to 15 times before someone in the situation seeks help. For me, I knew that I was a victim. I just didn't know all that I was a victim of. I wanted to get away. There was no Stockholm Syndrome or trauma bonding. I just didn't know what my options were. I was afraid of him, and I didn't know how to rebuild my life. I had a criminal record, and I was a high school dropout. What was I going to do? Not to mention all the trauma and undiagnosed PTSD. The man running my reality left nothing to chance. He took me to Tijuana, and he had me branded. Other than that, the geography of my abuse was quite local. My trafficker didn't lock me up in some deserted farmhouse miles from my town. We were just down the street from where I grew up. He separated me from my family and friends, a move that helps traffickers control you. Mine even married me. He also got a restraining order against my dad. My trafficker also involved me in petty scams that got me arrested. Once you have a record, it's that much harder to get a regular job, leaving you more dependent on your trafficker. There was one time when I was arrested, and the officer that put the handcuffs on me looked at my trafficker and said, "Why would you want to be with a girl like her?" When I finally got away from my trafficker, I went to an urgent care. I had a branding from him. I was 100 pounds. I couldn't go to the bathroom without an enema. My hair was falling out. I had various stages of bruising, and I was acting erratic. All classic signs of somebody that had not just been through trauma, but that had been trafficked. The doctors and nurses that were on shift, they all talked around me, but nobody talked to me. There was an assumption that I was a runaway or on drugs, but no one actually sat me down and asked, "Jenna, what happened to you?" When my life went wrong, I'd never been in trouble. I was going to go play college volleyball. I lived in what was said to be one of the safest communities in Southern California, the opposite of movies where bad things happen to good people, all dark alleys and foggy and foreign. But I was never educated about trafficking in my private Christian high school. If I had, my experience might have been prevented. At the very least, I would have known how to get help sooner. What would happen if I called 911? Would someone protect me? Was there a place that I could go? Who would help me figure out my life at that point? Isolated and afraid, I didn't have any answers. This is why I now tour the country speaking and training first responders and empowering communities on how to identify and how to respond to victims. Here, I don't just mean the front lines of the community like the ER and the police and teachers. I'm also talking about administrators, janitors, coaches, anyone that has contact with a child. A few years ago, I drove past a house not far from mine. I saw obvious signs of trafficking, women coming and going at all hours, one man, most likely the trafficker out front. I contacted the police, who said an investigation was pending. But what bothered me was that this was in plain sight, with people walking and driving past. That's why public awareness is so important in this fight. Why I speak at college and community forums educating people how to identify trafficking in their community, and also why I support the Foundation United, which does so much to protect young lives. According to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, 1 in 7 American kids will run away from home, and 1 in 3 will become victims of human trafficking within 48 hours. I remember when I first heard that statistic when I started doing this work, and that 48-hour time frame really struck me. That and the fact that so much tragedy goes unnoticed by the public. These stats, this reality, this is why I'm grateful that the Foundation United is dedicated to getting ahead of it through programs like their K-12 Speak Up Prevention curriculum, which is now in 34 states. They're protecting and guarding kids, giving them tools that I didn't have. Ask most survivors of human trafficking, and they'll tell you their story is not like the movie Taken. They weren't dragged out from under a bed or kidnapped and sold on a boat for $1 million. Their dad wasn't Liam Neeson with a special set of skills to come and rescue them, although my dad would argue that. So we need to see every victim, not just the ones that we imagine, but like me, an 18-year-old girl working a normal job during the day, but sold in her apartment at night. Or the 7-year-old girl being trafficked by her mom for drug money. Or the college student trapped in a dark world of sexual abuse while still getting A's in her classes. For when we picture tragedy happening only one way, we are missing all the other ways that it occurs. A trafficked girl has a 7-year lifespan. I didn't know it back then, but after years of this horror in me, finally something had enough. One night in a motel, I was physically beaten and raped. I knew that I had to get away. At this point, I was able to reconnect with my family, and I moved back home. But I didn't tell anyone. I wanted to, but I was still afraid of my trafficker and what would happen to me. I planned to go my whole life with this secret, and I tried to move forward. I married. I had a son. We moved to a Marine Corps base on the other side of the country. And then the next part of my journey began ordinarily enough. I'd gone to the doctor for a routine checkup, including a pelvic exam. As it began, I kind of had this panic attack, which I know was a flashback, something I had experienced a few times prior, though no one ever said anything about it. Afterward, the doctor took me into her office, and she sat me down and said, "Jenna, have you ever been sexually abused?" It was 6 years since I'd escaped the physical part of being trafficked. How did she know? When I went to the doctors, when I got away from my trafficker, I was 100 pounds, had my hair falling out, had my branding and all the other signs. This was the first time that it felt like a professional truly cared. Soon after, I had a breakdown caused by my undiagnosed PTSD. I went to a psychiatric hospital, after which I discovered that sharing my story was a way of shining a light on something nobody saw. In doing this work, I have learned that trafficking, like many enterprises, has a business model that includes finding supply to meet demand. Increasingly, young people are educated to be on the lookout for those who might do them harm, and many kids are completely unaware how to spot the red flags and identify traffickers. Traffickers know this, and they send their recruiters, often one of their other victims, to gain their trust, befriend a girl or boy, and lure them away, isolating them from their support system. After grooming them, they begin to traffic them, and any child can fall into this trap. Amid harrowing numbers, every community has to be educated, for it takes everyone doing their part, empowering the front lines to protect our kids, because we, you and me, we are still in this together. It is my hope that every time I speak to a community, the things will be different for the next girl or boy, your child or your grandchild, because somebody in the audience is going to do something for them. I share my story to empower other survivors and to work with great groups like the Foundation United, which strives to see a world united against trafficking and abuse. They and their partners, among whom I am proud to be one, raise support to help victims of trafficking and abuse and help them on the road to recovery. Victims no longer, but empowered survivors. During my exploitation, I always thought, how do I get out of a world that I did not agree to? Today, one of the best parts of my job is to look a survivor in the eye and say, "You are my past, and I am your future." Thank you.